Hello, welcome to the Bearded Tits podcast, hosted by me, Jack Perks. Professionally, I'm a wildlife cameraman, but I dabble in podcasting, and each Tuesday we release an episode as I have a chat with scientists, artists, filmmakers, and passionate people all about nature in a light-hearted and certainly not serious way. Hello, how are we all doing? Well, today my guest is Peter Cairns. He is the Executive Director of Scotland The Big Picture. This is an initiative to drive the recovery of nature across Scotland through rewilding in response to the growing climate and biodiversity crisis. I definitely didn't just read that off the website. Now, they've got some incredible media that they use for this. There's some great people working on it, and it's something that I've been watching very closely over the years. The subject of today's chat is lynx and the reintroduction of lynx. They were a species that were in the UK, so potentially get them back. Before we talk about that though, let's talk about buymeacoffee.com. So if you want to support the podcast, this is the only way that I make any coffers. So if you can donate whatever you can afford, it is greatly appreciated. We're currently on 95% of our goal to get a new microphone, so if you can chuck some money my way, that is much appreciated. And there's a link in the description to buymeacoffee.com. Now, I mentioned that we're going to do a Q&A, so for those questions that people sent in, I'll answer them at the end of the podcast. So stick around. If you did send a question in, I'll answer that at the end. Today, me and Pete talk about when we last had lynx in the UK, what are the potential positives of having them, what are the potential negatives of having them, and when we could potentially get these animals back in the British Isles. Here's our chat. Well, welcome to the podcast, Pete.
Yeah, hi Jack, how are you doing?
I'm good, I'm lucid, how are you?
Good, well I wouldn't go as far as lucid, but I'm present.
Where are we today for listeners?
So we're stood in a pine forest in Shriach in the Cairns. This is part of what is becoming a pretty well-known restoration or rewilding project, call it what you will, called Cairns Connect. So we're surrounded by birch and Scots pine and some deadwood on the floor and some deadwood standing, a nice rich pine forest.
It's so quiet. I say quiet, but there's some birds flitting around. We did see a crested tit just before recording, and if there's anyone who's really good at bird calls, they might be able to hear that as we are going. But we're not talking about crested tits today. We're talking about lynx, charismatic megafauna, divided by various people. So before we get into the nitty-gritty of it, let's just talk stats. So how big are lynx?
So a lynx is or the Eurasian lynx, as I should point out, because there are different species of lynx, but the Eurasian lynx is the one we're concerned with. That's the one that used to live across the whole of the UK, about the size of a Labrador, about the weight of a border collie, so medium-sized. These are solitary hunters. They don't roam in packs like wolves do, for example. Pretty much confined to wooded habitats, forests, and they're an ambush predator. They sneak up on their prey and seize it right at the last minute. So they're not built for stamina or speed as such, they're built for surprise attacks. So this, where we are today, is exactly the type of habitat that a lynx would live in.
So they're preferring woodland, they're not likely to be out in open areas?
No, because they need that cover to ambush their prey. And as a consequence, their main prey are woodland deer, things like roe deer. A big red deer is too big for a lynx, but they would certainly take red deer, hinds and calves. And of course in Scotland, what would be a really useful service from lynx is getting in amongst woodland to take out non-native sika deer, which are notoriously difficult to hunt, as we would do, human hunting. So yeah, they would provide a deer management service, so to speak.
Okay, I didn't know they'd take something as big as a sika or a small red. They'll take that down pretty happily, will they?
Yeah, it depends. I mean, a big male lynx certainly would. A smaller female maybe would think twice about it. What you've also got to bear in mind with lynx is that because they're solitary and because they are territorial to a degree, they occupy huge home ranges to the order of several hundred square kilometres. There's a study been done in northern Scandinavia where prey densities are very, very low by default, and you have male lynx ranging over more than 1,000 square kilometres. So even in a national park as big as the Cairns, which is Britain's largest, 4,600 square kilometres, you're never going to have lots of lynx. These animals are isolated and spread out across a wide landscape.
Yeah, so the chances of seeing one would be... I remember seeing... I I should really know this off the top of my head. David, the guy who did the book for you, David
Hetherington. Yeah.
And he was doing a talk at the Grant Arms, and he was talking about even in places where they're common, the chances of seeing a lynx are pretty slim, really, isn't it?
Yeah, almost zero in many places.
Yeah.
I can remember actually a pretty funny story. I was in Sweden,
Scandinavia,
Finland. Actually, I was in Finland. That's where I was a number of years ago, photographing ospreys. I was only there for 4 days, and believe it or not, I did see a lynx. And I rang a Finnish friend of mine who was 52 years old at the time and said, what are the chances? And he said, I'm 52 and I've never seen one. And I was there for 4 days. So yeah, they're really, really elusive. And they operate as most cats do at dawn and dusk. So by that nature, it's going to be, you'd be very, very lucky to run into one.
So if we release lynx, I mean, the Cairngorm's an obvious one. Would that be the only option, or would there be anywhere else in the UK? Or is that running before we can walk sort of territory?
It's not necessarily running before we can walk. There is no biophysical reason why lynx couldn't exist across much of the UK. Even surprisingly, perhaps even in human modified landscapes where there are populations of people. This is not an animal that needs wilderness, and the same goes for wolves actually. Most people perceive they need these huge wild spaces. That's not the case. The barrier to lynx is not lynx or deer or trees, it's people. It's people's attitudes and perceptions and beliefs and motivations and values in life. Those are infinitely complicated, but there's no physical reason why lynx couldn't make a good living in the UK. It's just down to whether we are prepared to live alongside them. So
what are the concerns people have then? If there are kind of voices rising up, what are they worried about with lynx? Yeah,
I mean, the answer to that is varied, hugely varied.
Yeah.
But if we just maybe take a step back from the question, I think to a degree, knowledge gaps play a big part in people's perceptions. They're not familiar with this animal. And if you think about it logically, we're kind of culturally attached to wolves and bears, for example. We've grown up with stories of those animals. We feel that we know them. Those stories were very rarely accurate, but we kind of feel a connection with those animals. Lynx is not part of our cultural heritage or cultural history. So it is an unknown animal. Most people don't know what they look like. They don't know how big they are. They don't know what they feed on. They don't know whether they're a danger or not. So I think perceptions on lynx are hugely varied. Some of it informed, a lot of it misinformed. But going back to your question, I think there is a question inevitably with a large predatory mammal. Are they safe? Are they safe for me, my children, my pets? Livestock, of course, is a major concern, especially sheep. Availability of prey. So in other words, is this a suitable habitat from a lynx welfare point of view to bring a lynx back to? Have we got enough habitat? Are they likely to cross roads and get run over? So are there welfare issues? And everything else in between. So there's a huge variety of opinions and perspectives, and people look at lynx through many, many different lenses.
And with any rewilding, which is the question you probably hate getting asked, or a lot of rewilders hate getting asked, is what's the point? Why bring them back? Why bring the lynx back? Is there a benefit to the ecosystem, or is it more of a thing that they were here, so they should still be here? What's the reason for getting them back here?
I would say there are four main reasons. The first one is an ecological one, as you alluded to. So if you look at this forest and draw an analogy with a car engine, for example,
or a plane engine above us,
or a plane engine that's
always a fucking plane going over when I do these, but it's more of a cameo at this point, so I wouldn't worry, Pete. You can crack on. There are always some. Hopefully they're dumping plenty of carbon in the atmosphere, so you can crack on your nice holiday wherever you're going.
We all get on planes, don't we?
Yeah.
Well, let's take a plane engine, for example.
Okay.
You could, I don't know anything about plane engines, but I would imagine that you could take away 2, 3, 4, 10 components of that plane engine and it would still fly. You take away 20 and it may start to splutter. You take away 30 and it plummets from the sky. And our ecosystems are no different. They're a set of components that all work together to provide an efficient engine system. And what we've done, of course, is gradually dismantle or take away components of that system. And one of the main levels of component we've taken away is apex predators. We have none. So that whole sort of trophic level, that management of an ecosystem by large predators and their impact on predators lower than them in the food chain, as it were, and also their prey, has had a huge detrimental effect, ecologically speaking, on our ecosystem. So there's an ecological rationale behind lynx coming back. There's an economic consideration. They provide an efficient deer management service, which is a cost to the public purse. There's also obviously opportunities in terms of attracting nature-based tourism to a more nature-rich landscape. But touching on a point that you made, I think there is a moral obligation for us to bring back an animal that we forced into extinction. Lynx and bears and wolves are now spreading across mainland Europe. You know, there are now wolves living in France, Italy, Germany, Spain, the Netherlands of all places.
Yeah.
It's not that we can't live with lynx, it is that we won't. It's as simple as that. And then I think finally, which I think is significant, if you just zoom out a little bit to a global perspective, you know, Scotland was one of the first countries to declare a climate emergency. Scotland's government recognises that climate breakdown is inextricably linked with global nature loss. So I would argue, we're in the UN decade of ecosystem restoration, I would argue that Scotland has a duty to play its role in restoring global nature loss, in restoring biodiversity. And lynx is just one part of that. It's not the only part. But if we expect other countries, and especially those that live with large predators, India with tigers, Africa with lions, Europe with wolves or bears, we can't sit in judgment on those countries when we're not prepared to do the same ourselves and play our role in what has to be a global effort. So I think there are lots of different reasons, some of them at a sort of micro level, some of them at more of a macro level.
Yeah, no, I think that's a fair point. It's interesting when you say about the wolves coming up to the Netherlands. I think in Belgium now as well.
Yeah.
And I was talking to, I don't know if you come across Harvey Tweets, the kind of Celtic,
I know who he is, yeah.
The frog kid. And he was saying if we still had a land bridge with Europe, there's a very good chance wolves would have probably just walked across through Dartford and made their way to England at the rate that they've spread across Europe on their own.
Yeah, I mean, that's the irony, you know, through a convoluted set of geological forces, if you like, or meteorological forces, that low-lying land between England and France got flooded, 5,000-6,000 years ago, and cut us off. We're now an island. I think that brings along with it a certain mindset, not always a healthy mindset.
No.
But you're right. You know, if that water didn't exist and it was solid land, we would probably have all of those predators, or at least a presence of those predators, still in the UK. So, yeah, it's a strange set of quirks that give rise to the situation that we're in.
When did we last have lynx in the UK? Do we know roughly when we had them? Or
yeah, there's a little bit of debate over that, to be fair, but I suppose the headline is that carbon dating suggests that lynx were here as recently as 500 years ago, which in geological time is a mere blink of the eye. Yeah. And that kind of makes sense. You know, we're talking about a much more forested landscape historically. They're difficult to track down, they're difficult to hunt. So yeah, lynx around about 500 years ago, wolves around about 250 years ago.
Oh, so wolves persisted longer than lynx?
Yeah, because wolves are a more adaptable and you know, from at a sort of an evolutionary level, a more successful species. Most canids do,
right.
As long as they're not routinely persecuted, they reproduce very quickly, and they're pretty adaptable in terms of food source. So it makes sense that a dog creature would last longer than a cat creature.
Yeah. Well, dogs are generally better than cats anyway. That's my humble opinion. With lynx, do we know why? I mean, presumably persecution is why they were wiped out. Is that, or is it more complicated?
We don't know.
We don't know.
It's a simple
Okay.
answer, but I think as with most of these species, it's reasonable to assume that habitat loss and fragmentation coupled with hunting pressure, put the nail in the coffin.
So if we were to reintroduce lynx, where would they come from? Would it be captive bred lynx? Would it be, I guess, not problem lynx, but lynx that are somewhere with an excess of lynx, or how would we get them?
Yeah, so funnily enough, I've been in a meeting about that very subject this morning. So the Lynx to Scotland project, which we're involved with, and so is Trees for Life, and so is a charity called Lifescape. We're looking at many of these aspects right now. So there's a social side to this, is talking with stakeholders about their fears and their concerns and how they can be overcome or at least mitigated. But then there's a practical side of things. Where do you get the animals from? Are they, as you say, are they wild? Are they captive bred? Do you get animals from different countries? What is the protocol with regard to things like quarantine, for example? Where do you release them? Do they need a hard release, a soft release? All of this discussion is going on right now. But in answer to your question, the suggestion is that the lynx would be probably wild living and probably come from a combination of the Baltic countries and or Scandinavia. That's the conversation that's going on at the moment. That might change, but that's what we're looking at.
Flicking through David's book last night, as I'm obviously very prepared for these, I was looking on the map in that book, and that was a big green blob. Basically, it looks like there's very healthy populations of lynx there currently, so I don't think taking a few is going to make too much of a difference.
No, and in many countries, if not most countries, they are expanding in number, and that's as a result of more habitat being provided, and also a softening of public attitudes to large predators, and that has allowed not only lynx, but as I said, wolves and bears, and in some areas wolverine, to start recolonising places where they've not been seen for generations. So there is a really, there's a major wildlife comeback going on in Europe. At the moment, we're not part of that.
No, definitely not. How many lynx would we be able to support in the Cairngorms or Highlands?
Well, David's book is the only sort of reference point we have, and he put a lot of effort into researching or mapping the available habitat, taking into account social and cultural attitudes, and the headline figure is round about 400 lynx north of the Central Belt, and then if you took in the forests in Dumfries and Galloway, probably another 100 south of the Central Belt. So let's in round terms say 500 in Scotland as a whole.
Oh, fantastic! That's more than I thought, because it's quite a. Like I say, the chances of seeing them are pretty slim, but not impossible.
No, not impossible. I mean, whether we would, as it were, tolerate that number is a different issue.
Course,
but again, ecologically speaking or biologically speaking, that's the sort of number that the country could accommodate.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And when it comes down to cost, because people are always interested, like, well, how much is this going to cost? But presumably it's something that's going to be funded privately or with charities and whatnot that would kind of come up with all of that and sort it out.
Yeah, it's definitely not coming out of the public
purse.
No. I can guarantee that. I mean, the normal route for these reintroductions, and I draw a comparison with beavers, is a combination of traditional charitable funding and or private investment. And I think lynx being what they are, large predator, the first time it's ever been done in the UK, there's going to be a significant contribution from the private sector.
Yeah, that makes sense, because I guess there's a lot of paperwork and dare I say bureaucracy in these sort of things.
Huge.
Yeah, I know you probably don't want to shoot yourself in the foot here, Pete, so I'm not trying to lead you down a hole.
It is significant for any animal being moved. I mean, whether that's justified or not is a different thing, but for a large predator, you can imagine. In fact, there's a wildcat reintroduction program running at the moment, and I know that the license application for that has very recently gone in and consisted of upwards of 400 pages. So there's a lot of documentation that has to support these applications before you get a license, which effectively gives you permission to go ahead with a reintroduction.
Is that the Devon one? The one they're trying to do down
south? No, this is one being run by the Royal Zoological Society of Scotland, a project called Saving Wildcats. So it has parallels with lynx. There's different animal, obviously, but same sort of approach and methodology.
I can sympathise somewhat because I've been in touch with some of the guys trying to reintroduce burbot in some of the rivers, and that's just a fish. You wouldn't think it caused that much conflict, but Jesus, the trouble we're having with that. So I can only imagine that the hassle with a predator like a lynx. So we've touched on bears and wolves a little bit, so I'll just mention those quickly. Like, obviously lynx, I can see, and I'd love to see those back. Do you think there'd ever be a Scotland where we'd potentially get wolves and bears, or is that kind of a pipe dream?
I think if you'd have asked me that question not very long ago, I'd have probably said no, or maybe at least not in my lifetime. And I think, in all honesty, bears are a pipe dream at this stage.
Yeah.
It's difficult to say. I think things are moving so quickly at the moment. Politically, we live in a very fluid situation. Socioeconomically, we live in a very fluid situation. And the momentum that rewilding in its widest sense now has behind it, I don't know. I think things can change quite quickly. If you think about other wolf reintroductions, and I'm thinking of the most famous one in Yellowstone in '95, that the campaign to bring them back started 25 years before they were actually released. And ultimately, it took an alignment of the sort of political cogs, the personalities really, in the political system, to come into alignment, just provide a little bit of a window of opportunity, and wolf advocates were straight through it. I know a number of the people involved in that, and if you'd have said to them 6 months prior to that alignment, was it possible, they'd have probably said no. But all of a sudden the cogs shifted and there was a chink and they were through it. So who knows? I think we live in a very, very fluid society, and I think the younger generation are being much more vocal about their concerns over not only climate breakdown but also ecological decline. And those voices will become louder and stronger and more influential. So yeah, who knows what's around the corner. For us right now, focuses on Lynx. Forget wolves, it's just a distraction.
Yeah, no, I think that's probably the best way to go. And we've mentioned deer a few times, and a lot of people are like, oh, what's the problem with deer hanging around? But obviously, they in huge numbers of deer do have a big ecological impact, don't they?
Yeah, it's not deer, it's densities of deer. And of course, historically, the Victorian sporting model encourages the maximisation of deer numbers for all different reasons. So we do have a situation in Scotland where, putting aside the absence of large predators, we have high deer densities in many, many areas. And ironically, the view, as it were, in inverted commas, that is celebrated, on the front of shortbread tins and on the front of all those glossy tourist brochures, it is a view, spectacular and dramatic as it is a view of ecological impoverishment. Those areas, Glencoe being a good example, would historically have been really well wooded and would have had a much more abundant and diverse array of wildlife than it does today. So we've conditioned ourselves, we've normalised this degraded landscape. And as I say, I'm not taking away from its drama or beauty, but ecologically speaking, it is impoverished. And I'm afraid that deer, red deer in particular, or the densities of red deer, perpetuate that situation. So in some ways, the presence of a large predator and deer densities are related, but politically speaking, they're two different discussions.
Yeah. I see what you mean.
I mean, whether lynx or wolves ever come back to Scotland aside, something has to be done about deer densities in some areas. It's not the case everywhere.
No.
But if you look around here, for example, Glenfeshie is a very often sort of quoted example of what can happen when deer densities are reduced, and they were reduced significantly about 15 years ago. And if you walk up there today, the amount of woodland regeneration is incredible. It's unrecognisable compared to what it was 15, 20 years ago. So
they're eating saplings and things like that, young trees, or damaging bark. Or...
You used to go up there, and it was almost like going into the Serengeti. There was a bowling green, effectively, on which 100, 150 red deer would just lounge around munching away. They had an easy life. And on one level, that was a really spectacular thing to see. But you go up there now and you just see the difference. And whether you like the difference or not, you can't deny the cause and effect. You can't deny that the reduction in grazing pressure has resulted in this massive pulse of native woodland. And that's happening not only in Glenfeshie, but up in Abernethy and Rothiemurchus and in Shriach and other areas as well. So there is, again, going back to lynx, there is more habitat for lynx being, as it were, produced. And that's not only good for lynx, it's good for a whole range of different species, but that's mainly being done where deer grazing pressure is being reduced.
Because even if the lynx will obviously eat deer, but there's I forget the term. It's like the fear of predators keeps them on the move, and like you said, they're lounging around on a bowling green. If there's predators, they're not going to be doing that. So that's one advantage. But then obviously they'll be picking off the odd deer. And I'm sure in David's talk he mentioned lynx prefer the haunch, or they like the back of the leg. That's their favourite bit. And if there's enough food, they'll just go and get another deer, which you might think is wasteful. But of course that carcass is then going to provide food for ravens and insects and fertilise the ground. So it's not a waste at the end of the day. It's going to support for a plethora of other wildlife.
Yeah, exactly. And going back to the car or the aeroplane engine, large carcass ecology and everything that goes with it, most of which you've just described, is a missing or at least a suppressed ecological interaction in Scotland. We tend to drag deer carcasses off the hill. Livestock we're not allowed by law to leave on the ground. So I know it sounds a little bit morbid, but we haven't got enough dead bodies lying around, and so the impact of a large predator killing a deer is not just on the deer itself. Obviously, that creature is dead and is no longer able to browse or graze. But the whole ecological process that kicks into action as a result of that dead body lying in the forest is immense. And as you say, scavengers take advantage of it, insects take advantage of it, and eventually it delivers its nutrients back into the forest, which creates new tree growth, which is good for a whole range of species. So again, that's one of those processes, those conveyor belts that is interrupted or suppressed, or in some cases completely absent across the UK.
Yeah, I'm all for it. Let's do it. And I guess the $1 million question, how soon could they? Or is there no way of knowing that at the minute? Is it too early to find out? Or in an ideal world, let's say that everyone goes, yes, we're well up for it. What kind of timescale are we looking at?
Well, first of all, that's not going to happen.
I'm sure it will. I'm sure everyone will be keen.
I suppose depressingly, in some ways, it is a political decision.
Yes.
It's not an ecological decision.
No.
And arguably it's not even a societal decision. So, yeah, again, it comes back down to how the political stars align. At the moment in Scotland, we have an alliance between the SNP and the Greens, which has opened the door for species like beavers, for example. So you would argue that there is a favourable wind blowing, so to speak, at the moment. How long that's going to blow for, I don't know. But fickle as it may sound, this decision could come down to who's holding the decision-making power at any given time. I have to say, and yeah, I might live to regret saying this, I don't think it's any longer an if. I do think it's a when.
Okay.
And I think that has changed in the last 3, 4, 5 years. And I think it's public knowledge, or it's those knowledge gaps being gradually filled, people becoming more informed. And again, that bigger backdrop of climate breakdown and global nature loss. These are all narratives that are feeding in to the need to restore our ecosystem so that they're healthy, functional and complete.
Cautiously optimistic?
Yeah, I'd go a little bit further than that, actually,
Okay.
without being overly maverick about it. I think, as I say, I feel it is a when rather than an if.
Yeah.
But I wouldn't like to say when. I would like to think it's in my lifetime. Hopefully, if I don't get run over by a bus, I've got a few years left. But yeah, well, all that I and others like me can do is keep pushing at that door, keep telling the story of the benefits that Lynx can bring, and acknowledging the disbenefits that they come with. These animals come with baggage. There's no question about that. As a society, can we adapt our mindset so that we can accommodate those disbenefits in order to take advantage of what I would consider to be the many benefits?
I suppose as well, if you look at some of the recent ones, like 20 years ago, would people have thought beavers would be back in Britain and eagles on the south coast of England? And it's happened. So
yeah.
I
Exactly.
suppose, anything's possible.
I think on a daily basis, it's tortuously slow and bureaucratic, as you say. But if you look back 20, 30 years, beavers are a good example, white-tailed eagles are a good example. They're talking about wildcats now in England, pine marten translocation, red squirrel translocation, all of these. Ironically, I think, 25 years ago, we didn't know how to do this stuff physically, practically. That's the easy bit now. We know how to restore forests, we know how to restore peatlands, we know how to translocate animals. It's the people stuff that remains the barrier.
Yeah, definitely.
And whether that's beavers, white-tailed eagles, even red squirrels, believe it or not, and as you say, burbot. People have a range of opinions for a different range of reasons, and it's those mindsets, those hearts and minds. That's the battleground, really, if there is one.
I guess that's why the stuff you do with Scotland, the big picture, is quite important, where you can produce, whether it's a book, whether it's a film, whether it's, whatever, just to help put the facts across. And I guess if people do have concerns, try and put them at ease a little bit and just show this is what's going to happen and here's a bit more information about it.
Yeah, I think we try to inform opinion. Those opinions might not be the same as mine, but at least please base them on fact rather than fiction.
Yeah.
So it's not my job necessarily to persuade people to want Lynx back, but if you're going to have a view, try and make it an informed view. And that's the knowledge gaps that we try to plug.
Yeah, here, I think so. Well, my hand is going blue. I think I'm going to fall off in a second, so we'll wrap it up. But look, it's been a pleasure talking to you, Pete, in a very lovely setting, which has been quiet throughout most of this. So we could have probably just done this on Zoom, but hey ho, I'm in the Highlands anyway. So thanks for coming on, buddy.
Not a problem. Let's have a cup of tea.
Where Pete lives is like a fairy tale. He lives in this incredible area with mountains behind his house, a beautiful river, woodland, and if you just close your eyes, you can imagine 500,000 years ago. You can just imagine lynx brushing past your leg. Maybe not past your leg, but it's not that much of a stretch to imagine this predator stalking those forests. So it's amazing. I'm all for it. I think out of all the large predators, lynx are probably the most practical and likely to get reintroduced in the near future. We touched on deer management, and I am actually going out with a deer stalker for the podcast in a couple of weeks. So I'm going to go out and potentially shoot a deer while we're recording, which I know some people might be a little bit squeamish on. But deer overpopulation is a huge issue, and I think it's something worth talking about. So we are going to go out and see a little bit about that problem, not only because of an ecological issue, but people literally die from there being too many deer, road accidents and whatnot. So should be an interesting podcast, which will be out in a couple of weeks. Before we go, I did mention we do the Q&A. So I'm going to read out half a dozen questions that people sent in. Okay, so let's start with YouTube. So Peter Wise sent in this question, which is, what fish are the hardest to film underwater and which were the easiest? And did the behaviour or reactions to the camera of any surprise you? I'll start with easiest. Most cyprinids are pretty easy. Roach, rudd, stuff like that. Perch are... that's my dog barking. Perch are really easy because they'll come and investigate the camera. So most fish will kind of come up there. In terms of the hardest, you'd assume it'd be the rare ones, but actually, species like salmon are really difficult. Like, you can chuck a camera in a river and off you go, but to get good footage, decent behaviour, Atlantic salmon are pretty difficult to find the right river, the right conditions, the right times. So I would go out on a limb and say, even though salmon get shown on TV a lot, they're probably one of the hardest fish to film properly. They're a tricky fish. Another question from YouTube from Kubi Ark Survival put, hey, what about the aquarium and when will the next video of the aquarium be? So much greetings. So if you follow my YouTube channel, I occasionally post videos of like what I'm doing in my garden and particularly the aquariums that I've got. So I'm not planning another aquarium video anytime soon, purely because I've only just set up a coarsefish aquarium. So as I'm recording this, I'm just staring at it now. We've got minnows, roach, chub, carp, bream, stone loach, barbel, all kinds of lovely coarsefish in there. I don't get any work done because I end up staring at it all the time. But I am thinking about setting up a pike aquarium potentially in the spring. If I can get hold of a little pike, I might do that, and I may very well make a video on that as well. So no definitive answer. At some point in the future, I'll probably do another little video. Let's head over to Instagram. Funnily enough, this next question I've pretty much answered with the previous one, which is from Weir Landscapes. Hi Jack, love your native fish photography. Do you keep native fish in your aquarium? Yeah. Next question. yeah, I do. So I've pretty much just listed it. I also have a native fish pond in my garden, so I've got various native species of fish in there as well. Next question is from Tom Hump's Angling. This is where the questions start to go downhill slightly. If you had to have sex with any fish, what would it be and why? I can honestly say that's not something I've ever thought about. The mechanics of fish is that they don't actually have the equipment for that. Like, fish don't have a vagina, so getting stuck into a fish would be tricky. You'd have to get inventive, and I'll let you use your own imagination for that. But I mean, what am I at gunpoint? I suppose it's not a question I think about too much. I don't know. The right fish on the right day, who knows? Maybe a carp. Carp would be a good-looking fish. Get cracking into that. This is not the question I thought I'd be answering for this. Last question is from Anonymous, not the organisation online, but just they didn't want to leave their name. And they've put, Jack, how do you make your money? Which is, it's a bit personal, isn't it? So I'll answer this basically because I always get asked, is this your full-time job? And I'm a bit like, well, I've been doing this 10 years now, so I'd like to think people would know that. But I suppose with social media, people only show what they want you to see. So there are a lot of people who wildlife photography and filmmaking isn't their full-time job, but you maybe think that it is. But yeah, I can confirm I make all my money from taking pictures of wildlife and filming wildlife, predominantly fish. And if I were to break that up, it's kind of a mixture of... I guess more accurate would be wildlife media than photographer now, because although I do some stills, I do a lot of filming, editing, writing, podcasting, things like that. So lots of different things in the wildlife media world is how I make my money. But yeah, it is a full-time job. Anyway, that's the Q&As. If I get some more, I might do another Q&A episode later down the line. Now, next week's episode is another one of Jack Does Stuff, and I will be doing the Big Garden Bird Watch. So that will be an episode of me just looking out my window, seeing what birds come in the garden. I'm sure many of you did the Big Garden Bird Watch as well, so we're going to be covering that. This has been the Bearded Tits Podcast. I've been your host, Jack Perks, and I'll see you next Tuesday. Cheers.